They all believed the three children had been abandoned, but before dawn, one quiet decision from a woman everyone overlooked would change the future of the DeLuca family forever. The storm rolled across the hills outside the DeLuca estate with a steady rhythm, rain tapping against towering windows, while the sprawling mansion stood wrapped in darkness. Most of the staff had already retreated to their quarters after receiving unexpected instructions to leave the third floor untouched until morning. No one questioned unusual orders inside Lorenzo DeLuca's home. The billionaire businessman was respected, feared, and known for protecting his privacy above everything else. Yet as midnight drifted toward 1 o'clock, another sound slowly overpowered the rain. It began as a single cry, soft and uncertain, then another joined it, followed by a third until the heartbreaking chorus echoed through the empty hallways. Amara Johnson froze in the laundry room, a basket of neatly folded baby blankets resting against her hip. She had only worked at the estate for 12 days, filling in for an employee on medical leave, and she had already learned one rule repeated by every member of the household staff: never enter the nursery unless specifically invited. She lowered the basket onto a wooden table and listened again. The crying had changed. It no longer sounded like ordinary fussiness. It carried the desperate rhythm only someone who had spent years comforting frightened children could recognize. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, hoping another caregiver would answer. No footsteps came. No voices followed. Only the relentless cries filling every silent corner of the mansion. Her heart tightened. Years earlier, she had learned that sometimes the hardest choice was not stepping forward but walking away. She whispered a quiet prayer under her breath before picking up the basket again and making her way toward the grand staircase. Every polished step seemed louder than the last. Family portraits watched from the walls as lightning briefly illuminated the marble hallway leading to the nursery. The massive white door stood slightly open. Warm light spilled across the floor. Amara hesitated with one hand resting against the frame. Everything about this moment warned her to turn back. Losing this job would mean falling behind on rent again. It would mean searching for work in a city where opportunities rarely waited for women like her. But another cry shattered every practical thought. She stepped inside. 3 identical cribs stood side by side beneath soft golden lamps. Lorenzo DeLuca's infant triplets were crying with exhausted little voices, tiny hands reaching into empty air while untouched bottles rested on a nearby table. The room was immaculate, almost beautiful, yet it felt painfully lonely. No mother stood beside them. No nanny rocked them gently. No family member whispered reassurance. Only silence surrounded them once their cries paused long enough to catch another breath. Amara slowly placed the blankets beside the nearest crib. Her expression softened with quiet determination. Whatever consequences waited beyond that door could come later. Right now, 3 frightened babies needed someone to remind them they had not been left alone. Amara moved quietly from crib to crib, her calm presence slowly replacing the fear that had filled the nursery only moments before. She gently lifted the smallest of the triplets first, cradling the little boy against her shoulder while softly humming the same lullaby her grandmother had sung decades earlier on warm Georgia evenings. The melody carried no magic, only patience, kindness, and familiarity. Within seconds, the baby's desperate cries softened into uneven little breaths. She wrapped him in one of the blankets she had folded herself earlier that afternoon before carefully placing him back into his crib. The second child reached toward her almost immediately, tiny fingers curling around the sleeve of her simple housekeeping uniform as if recognizing comfort instead of a stranger. Amara smiled with quiet sadness. She had seen that expression before. Hungry babies did not only search for food. They searched for safety, warmth, and the certainty that someone would come when they cried. One by one, she checked their bottles, noticing they had long since cooled. She found the nursery. Warmer, prepared fresh bottles exactly as the written instructions indicated, tested each one carefully against her wrist, then patiently fed every child while speaking in a gentle voice barely louder than a whisper. Outside, thunder continued rolling across the sky, but inside the room another sound slowly replaced it. Tiny sighs, gentle coos, the peaceful rhythm of 3 exhausted infants finally drifting toward sleep. As the nursery settled into silence, Amara remained seated on the soft rug between the cribs instead of leaving. Experience had taught her that frightened babies often woke again only minutes after falling asleep if they sensed they were alone. She leaned against the side of one crib and watched their little chests rise and fall together. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe. Memories she spent years trying to bury quietly returned. There had once been another nursery, another tiny room painted pale blue, another future she had imagined would last forever. Life had rewritten that future with heartbreaking speed, leaving her with nothing except memories and a heart that refused to stop loving children who needed someone. She rarely spoke about that chapter anymore. Most people assumed her gentle nature came naturally. They never understood that compassion was sometimes born from grief that never completely disappeared. A sudden creak from the hallway pulled her back to the present. She quickly stood, expecting another employee to appear and order her out of the room. No one came. The mansion remained strangely empty. Even the security staff who usually rotated through every hallway seemed occupied elsewhere. She glanced toward the elegant family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Lorenzo DeLuca stood confidently beside his wife, Isabella, each holding one newborn, while a nanny held the third child just outside the camera's center. It looked like the perfect family captured in a perfect moment. Yet tonight that polished image felt painfully distant from reality. The triplets had been alone long enough for panic to replace simple discomfort, and no explanation made that easier to understand. Amara quietly collected the empty bottles, adjusted each blanket one final time, and turned toward the nursery door. Before she could take another step, the smallest baby released a tiny whimper without opening his eyes. She immediately walked back, resting 2 fingers gently against his little hand. Almost instantly, he relaxed again, holding onto her finger with surprising strength. Amara remained perfectly still, realizing that sometimes the smallest hands could carry the greatest responsibility without ever meaning to. The first hint that something was terribly wrong arrived just after 2 o'clock in the morning when the nursery monitor resting on a nearby cabinet began flashing a silent warning. One of the babies had developed a slight fever. Amara immediately reached for the digital thermometer stored inside a neatly labeled drawer. 99.8 degrees. Not dangerous yet, but high enough for an infant to need close attention. Before she could finish checking the second child, another reading appeared slightly higher. The third followed only minutes later. Her calm expression remained unchanged, but concern settled deep inside her heart. 3 infants developing fevers at nearly the same time was never something to ignore. She searched the emergency contact binder placed beside the changing table. Every instruction had been carefully organized. Pediatrician, family physician, household manager, private nurse. She picked up the nursery telephone and pressed the first number. No answer. She tried the second. Straight to voicemail. The private nurse did not respond either. Finally, she reached the overnight estate manager, whose exhausted voice answered after several rings. He sounded distracted and confused. He explained that the children's mother had unexpectedly dismissed the overnight nanny before leaving the estate late that evening. Several staff members had been reassigned, believing another caregiver had already arrived. Somehow, every person assumed someone else was watching the children. No one realized the nursery had been left completely unattended. Amara closed her eyes for only a second. It was the kind of mistake that happened when responsibility became everyone else's job instead of someone's promise. She quietly asked the manager to contact the pediatrician again before hanging up. There was no anger in her voice. The babies needed solutions, not blame. She filled a clean basin with lukewarm water, carefully following the pediatric care instructions printed inside the emergency binder. One by one, she gently cooled each little forehead with a soft washcloth, while speaking comforting words they could not yet understand, but somehow seemed to feel. The smallest boy reached for her hand again. His tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb with surprising determination. The little girl opened sleepy brown eyes and studied Amara's face before slowly relaxing against her shoulder. The third baby, who had been the loudest earlier that night, finally settled after hearing the familiar lullaby once more. Minutes passed, then another hour. The rain outside gradually weakened until only scattered drops tapped against the windows. Inside the nursery, however, time seemed frozen. Amara barely noticed the ache in her back from lifting 3 growing infants again and again. She had forgotten about the clock entirely. Every few minutes, she checked their temperatures, adjusted another blanket, warmed another bottle, or whispered another gentle reassurance. She did not know where Lorenzo DeLuca was. She did not know why no family member had returned. She only knew that 3 innocent children depended on whoever chose to stay beside them until morning. Just before dawn, headlights slowly swept across the front windows of the mansion. Powerful engines rolled into the circular driveway below. Doors opened outside. Calm voices echoed through the entrance hall. The household suddenly came alive with hurried footsteps after hours of silence. Amara looked toward the nursery door as the sleeping triplets rested peacefully for the first time all night. Somewhere downstairs, the owner of the estate had finally come home, completely unaware that the longest night of his children's lives had almost ended without anyone except the quiet housekeeper standing beside them. The front doors opened with quiet precision, and Lorenzo DeLuca stepped inside without saying a word. At 40 years old, he carried himself with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to making impossible decisions before sunrise. His charcoal overcoat was still damp from the storm, and the silver watch on his wrist reflected the warm lights of the grand foyer as members of his security team remained respectfully behind him. Normally, he would have gone directly to his private office to review reports before greeting anyone in the house. This morning was different. Before he could remove his gloves, the estate manager hurried forward with an expression Lorenzo had rarely seen in 15 years of loyal service. It was not fear. It was guilt. Lorenzo noticed it immediately. "What happened?" he asked quietly. The manager swallowed hard before explaining that there had been confusion among the overnight staff. The scheduled nanny had been dismissed unexpectedly. Several employees believed another caregiver had already arrived. Communication had failed. Lorenzo listened without interrupting, his blue eyes never leaving the man's face. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "Where are my children?" The manager hesitated just long enough for Lorenzo to understand something was terribly wrong. "They are upstairs, sir." Lorenzo did not wait for another explanation. He climbed the staircase with long, measured steps, every member of the household instinctively moving aside as he passed. The silence surrounding him felt heavier than anger. It carried disappointment, and those who worked for him knew disappointment was far more difficult to earn back. As he reached the 3rd floor, he expected to hear frantic crying after everything he had just been told. Instead, the hallway was almost completely quiet. Only the faint sound of someone humming drifted through the slightly open nursery door. Lorenzo slowed his pace. The melody was unfamiliar, soft enough to disappear beneath the morning breeze coming through the nearby windows. He gently pushed the door open and stopped without realizing it. 3 cribs stood peacefully beneath the morning light. His triplets were asleep, their tiny faces finally relaxed after a difficult night. Sitting in a wooden rocking chair between them was Amara Johnson. She had fallen asleep without intending to, still wearing her housekeeping uniform, one arm resting carefully across the smallest baby, whose tiny hand remained wrapped around her finger. An open emergency care binder rested on her lap beside 3 neatly washed bottles and a folded stack of damp cooling cloths. The room showed quiet evidence of hours spent caring instead of resting. Lorenzo's eyes moved slowly from one detail to another. The fresh blankets, the handwritten temperature notes on a notepad, the empty coffee cup left untouched beside the chair. Nothing about the scene suggested carelessness. Everything reflected patience. Behind him, the pediatrician entered the nursery carrying a medical bag after finally arriving from across the city. Without disturbing Amara, the doctor quietly examined each infant one at a time. Several long minutes passed before he looked toward Lorenzo with visible relief. "Their temperatures are already coming down," he said softly. Whoever stayed with them overnight followed every emergency instruction exactly. Had they remained alone for several more hours, this morning could have looked very different. Lorenzo remained silent. His gaze returned to the exhausted woman sleeping in the rocking chair. She had not asked for recognition. She had not waited for praise. She had simply stayed when everyone else had somehow disappeared. For the first time in many years, the powerful man everyone believed had seen everything found himself standing completely still, unable to look away from the quiet stranger who had protected the 3 people he loved most while expecting nothing in return. Amara opened her eyes slowly as the morning sunlight settled across the nursery floor. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. Then she saw 3 peaceful little faces sleeping soundly in their cribs and remembered every minute of the endless night. She quickly stood, embarrassed to realize she had fallen asleep in the rocking chair while still holding the smallest boy's tiny hand. As she turned, she froze. Lorenzo DeLuca was standing only a few feet away, his composed expression impossible to read. The pediatrician quietly finished writing notes on a medical chart before closing the folder. The room remained completely silent until the doctor finally spoke. Their temperatures have stabilized. They are hydrated, calm, and responding normally. Whoever cared for them recognized the early warning signs and acted immediately. That made all the difference. Lorenzo nodded once without taking his eyes off Amara. "Leave us for a moment," he said softly. The estate manager, the pediatrician, and the remaining staff quietly stepped into the hallway, gently closing the nursery door behind them. Amara lowered her eyes, preparing herself for the conversation she had expected since entering the room hours earlier. "I am sorry, sir," she said honestly. "I knew I was not authorized to enter the nursery, but I could not ignore them." Lorenzo remained silent long enough that every second seemed heavier than the last. Finally, he asked, "Did anyone tell you to stay?" She shook her head. "No, sir." "Did anyone promise you extra pay?" "No, sir." "Then why?" His question carried neither accusation nor anger. It carried genuine confusion. Amara looked toward the sleeping triplets before answering. Because they were alone. The simplicity of her response lingered in the quiet room. She did not mention the memories that had guided every decision throughout the night. She did not explain the nursery she had once prepared years ago or the dreams that had quietly disappeared before they ever became reality. Some grief became too personal for words. Lorenzo studied her face carefully. He had spent decades building businesses, negotiating impossible contracts, and learning to recognize hidden motives in every conversation. Yet he could not find one selfish reason behind the woman standing before him. Before either of them spoke again, the smallest boy stirred beneath his blanket. His sleepy eyes opened halfway, searching the room until they found Amara. Almost immediately, he reached both little arms toward her with a tiny impatient sound. Without thinking, Amara instinctively stepped closer to the crib before stopping herself, uncertain whether she still had permission. Lorenzo noticed everything. He quietly nodded once. "Go ahead." Amara gently lifted the little boy into her arms. Within seconds, his breathing slowed again as he rested his head against her shoulder with complete trust. The pediatrician, who had remained just outside the partially opened door, smiled to himself before speaking quietly enough that only Lorenzo could hear. That kind of response cannot be forced. Babies remember who made them feel safe. Lorenzo watched his son relax in Amara's embrace, and something shifted inside him that no business victory or financial success had ever accomplished. He had spent months believing he could solve every problem with planning, influence, and endless resources. Yet the one thing his children had needed most during the longest night of their young lives had not been wealth. It had been the quiet compassion of a woman who had every reason to walk away, but chose to stay instead. As the morning sun filled the nursery with warm light, Lorenzo realized he knew almost nothing about the woman who had protected the center of his entire world. The atmosphere inside the DeLuca estate changed so gradually that most employees could not identify the exact day it happened. They only knew the mansion no longer felt like a place built entirely from polished marble, expensive artwork, and carefully guarded silence. Tiny laughter occasionally echoed through the hallways where conversations had once been whispered. Nursery doors remained open during the afternoons, allowing warm sunlight to spill across the hardwood floors while 3 curious toddlers slowly discovered the world around them. Lorenzo kept his promise without making a grand announcement. Amara was no longer assigned to laundry or housekeeping. Instead, he quietly offered her a permanent position caring for the triplets. She accepted only after asking one unexpected question. Will they always have the people and supplies they need? Lorenzo had expected questions about salary, housing, or benefits. Instead, she had asked only about the children. He answered with a simple yes. That was enough for her. Days became weeks, and routines slowly replaced chaos. Every morning began with breakfast in the bright family kitchen instead of the formal dining room. Amara believed children should hear ordinary conversations, gentle laughter, and the sounds of daily life instead of growing up surrounded only by quiet perfection. She read picture books with animated voices, sang familiar songs while preparing bottles, and celebrated every tiny milestone as though it deserved applause. The first time one of the boys rolled over without assistance, she clapped so enthusiastically that all three babies laughed together. Several members of the staff stopped what they were doing simply to watch. Even the head chef smiled before returning to his work. Lorenzo noticed these moments from a distance. He rarely interrupted them. Instead, he found himself lingering outside the nursery after long meetings, quietly listening before stepping inside. He had built companies by studying numbers and recognizing patterns. Now he found himself studying entirely different things. He noticed how each child responded differently to Amara's voice. The oldest girl always smiled first when hearing footsteps in the hallway. The middle boy reached for her hand whenever he felt uncertain. The youngest still refused to fall asleep unless she softly hummed the same gentle melody from that unforgettable night. One afternoon, Lorenzo returned home earlier than expected after a meeting had been canceled. As he entered the family room, he stopped without making a sound. Amara sat cross-legged on a thick cream-colored rug surrounded by wooden blocks and brightly colored books. The triplets crawled happily around her, each determined to show off a different discovery. One proudly stacked 2 blocks together before knocking them over with delighted laughter. Another offered her a stuffed elephant with complete seriousness, as though presenting a priceless treasure. The smallest boy struggled to his feet using the edge of the sofa before taking one wobbly step toward her. Amara did not rush forward. Instead, she knelt with open arms and an encouraging smile. "You can do this," she whispered gently. "Take your time. I am right here." The little boy took another uncertain step before tumbling safely into her embrace, laughing with pure delight. Without realizing it, Lorenzo smiled. It was small, almost invisible, but genuine enough that the security officer standing nearby quietly looked away, recognizing he had just witnessed something deeply personal. Lorenzo had spent years believing strength meant standing alone through every challenge. Yet watching his children flourish taught him another truth entirely. Sometimes the strongest foundation a family could have was not built through power or success. Sometimes it began with one compassionate person who chose to love without asking for recognition, reward, or even the promise of tomorrow. Several months passed, and the rhythm of the DeLuca estate settled into something that almost resembled peace. The triplets had grown stronger, their laughter filling rooms that had once echoed with silence. Yet there remained one mystery Lorenzo could never quite understand. Every time one of the children scraped a tiny knee while learning to walk, woke frightened after a bad dream, or reached the edge of tears, Amara comforted them with a tenderness so instinctive it seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than professional experience. She never hesitated. She never appeared impatient. She simply knew exactly what each child needed before anyone else noticed. Lorenzo found himself wondering how someone acquired that kind of quiet wisdom. One rainy afternoon, while organizing personnel records in his private study, he noticed that Amara's employment file was unusually thin. Basic identification, references, background check, nothing more. It was as though an entire chapter of her life had been carefully folded away and left untouched. Curiosity was not something Lorenzo usually entertained, but gratitude had a way of opening doors that power never could. Rather than ordering an investigation, he called the director of the charitable community center listed among her references. He expected to hear about volunteer work or childcare experience. Instead, an elderly woman answered with a warm voice that immediately recognized Amara's name. "She still does not talk about them very often," the woman said gently. "But every child who walks through our doors feels loved because of what she survived." Lorenzo listened quietly as the woman explained that several years earlier Amara had prepared a nursery in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago after months of dreaming about becoming a mother through foster care. She had attended parenting classes, painted tiny stars across the nursery ceiling, filled shelves with donated books, and carefully folded baby clothes she found at church drives and neighborhood yard sales. Then, only weeks before the placement was finalized, unexpected legal complications permanently changed the outcome. The children she had hoped to welcome were placed elsewhere. Overnight, the nursery became an empty room filled with unopened dreams. Most people would have packed everything away. Amara had chosen something different. She donated every toy, every blanket, every tiny outfit to families who needed them more than she did. After that, she quietly devoted herself to helping children at shelters, hospitals, churches, and community centers whenever someone asked. She never sought attention. She simply refused to let love disappear because life had disappointed her. Lorenzo remained silent long after the conversation ended. He slowly looked across his study toward the family room, where the afternoon sunlight streamed through wide windows. On the floor, Amara was helping the triplets build a tower from colorful wooden blocks. Every time the tower collapsed, the children burst into laughter, and Amara laughed with them as though nothing in the world mattered more than that simple moment. Lorenzo suddenly understood something he had completely misunderstood from the beginning. Amara had never cared for his children because they belonged to an influential family or because the position offered stability. She cared for them because her heart had already chosen long ago that no child should ever feel unwanted. The realization settled heavily inside him. He had spent much of his life measuring people by achievements, influence, and success. Yet the woman who had transformed his home carried none of those things as her greatest accomplishment. Her greatest strength was that disappointment had never convinced her to stop loving. As Lorenzo quietly watched his children run toward Amara with joyful little smiles, he realized the greatest gift they had received was not simply her care. It was the example of a heart that remained kind after every reason the world had given it to become hard. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees surrounding the DeLuca estate in shades of amber and gold. Inside the mansion, the triplets had begun speaking their first simple words, filling every hallway with joyful little voices that seemed to erase the memory of the lonely night that had brought Amara into their lives. Then, without warning, the peace they had carefully built was interrupted by a single black luxury sedan pulling into the circular driveway one crisp October afternoon. The front door opened, and Isabella DeLuca stepped inside as though she had never truly left. She looked elegant, confident, and perfectly composed, carrying herself with the polished grace expected by every magazine that had once celebrated her as the face of one of the country's most influential families. Several members of the household exchanged uncertain glances before quietly stepping aside. Lorenzo met her in the grand foyer, his expression calm but unreadable. Isabella offered a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "I would like to see my children," she said evenly. Lorenzo nodded once. "They are in the family room." Neither of them raised their voices. Neither spoke about the months that had passed in silence. Upstairs, Amara was helping the triplets finish a colorful puzzle when the little girl suddenly looked toward the hallway. Tiny footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor before Isabella appeared at the doorway. The room fell completely still. Amara immediately stepped back, lowering her eyes respectfully. She had no intention of standing between a mother and her children. Isabella walked forward with an elegant smile and gently called their names. The three toddlers looked at her with quiet curiosity. She knelt with open arms, expecting them to run toward her. Instead, they remained exactly where they were. The oldest boy glanced at Amara before reaching for her hand. The little girl quietly hid behind Amara's shoulder. The youngest simply continued stacking wooden blocks, as though the unfamiliar woman standing nearby was another visitor passing through the house. A brief silence settled over the room. Isabella's smile faltered for only a moment before she stood again. "Children need time," she said softly, though disappointment was impossible to hide completely. Lorenzo had witnessed everything without saying a word. That evening, Isabella requested a private conversation in the library. She explained that she wanted to rebuild her public image, restore her place within the family, and gradually resume a greater role in the children's lives. Lorenzo listened respectfully until she finished speaking. Then he asked one quiet question. "Can you tell me their favorite bedtime song?" Isabella hesitated. "I have been away." Lorenzo nodded gently. "Their favorite story?" Another silence followed. "The name of the stuffed elephant the youngest carries every night." Isabella looked toward the window, unable to answer. Lorenzo did not speak with anger. His voice remained calm, almost compassionate. Children do not measure love by photographs, family names, or appearances. They remember who stayed beside them when they were frightened. Those words lingered in the room long after the conversation ended. Down the hallway, Amara quietly packed a small overnight bag in the staff quarters. She believed her work was finished now that the children's mother had returned. She folded every uniform with the same care she used when she had first arrived and wrote a short letter thanking Lorenzo for the opportunity to care for the triplets. She never mentioned disappointment because she had never expected to become a permanent part of anyone's family. As she gently closed the suitcase, there was a soft knock at her door. Before she could answer, 3 tiny voices called her name almost in perfect unison from the other side, followed by Lorenzo's calm voice asking if they could come in. Amara slowly opened the door, still holding the folded letter she had planned to leave behind. Standing in the hallway were Lorenzo and the 3 toddlers, each wearing matching knit sweaters the housekeeper had chosen that morning. Before a single word could be spoken, the little girl rushed forward and wrapped both tiny arms around Amara's leg. Her brothers quickly followed, laughing as though they had discovered the greatest hiding place in the world. Amara knelt instinctively, embracing all 3 children while quietly blinking away unexpected tears. Lorenzo waited until the room became still again before speaking. "I found your letter," he said gently, holding the unopened envelope between his fingers. "You thank me for giving you a place in this house." He paused, watching the children refuse to let go of her. "The truth is that you gave this house something it did not have before you arrived." Amara lowered her eyes. "Their mother has come home. They deserve the chance to know her. I never wanted to stand in the way of that." Lorenzo nodded with quiet understanding. "Neither do I. Isabella will always be their mother, and nothing should ever erase that. They deserve every opportunity to build a healthy relationship with her." He took another slow step forward. "But they also deserve to keep the person who stayed beside them when no one else realized they had been left alone." The room fell silent except for the cheerful giggles of the youngest boy, who had somehow managed to place one of his toy blocks into Lorenzo's coat pocket. Lorenzo smiled, removed the block, and handed it back before looking at Amara once more. "I spent most of my life believing that loyalty could be purchased, respect could be demanded, and security could be built with money. You proved every one of those beliefs incomplete." Amara looked at him with quiet surprise. Lorenzo continued, his voice steady but deeply sincere. "You never asked for recognition. You never asked for more money. You never reminded anyone what you did that first night. You simply kept showing up every morning with kindness. That is something I cannot replace." He carefully placed the unopened letter back into her hands before asking the question that had been resting on his heart for weeks. "Would you stay, not because this is your job, but because this has become your family too?" Amara looked down at the 3 smiling children surrounding her. The oldest boy reached up and gently touched her cheek before saying the clearest sentence he had ever spoken. "Stay with us." Her composure finally broke. Tears slipped quietly down her face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that the empty place in her own heart had slowly been filled without her noticing. She nodded once. "I would be honored." Months later, the DeLuca estate celebrated the triplets' birthday beneath strings of warm lights stretched across the garden. Friends, neighbors, employees, and volunteers from the community center where Amara had once served gathered together, laughing as the children raced across the lawn with colorful balloons. Isabella attended as well, choosing to spend time with the children without trying to rewrite the past. Healing came slowly, but it came honestly. As the evening sun settled behind the trees, Lorenzo stood quietly watching the family he had almost lost. The mansion was still magnificent, but its greatest treasure had never been hidden inside marble walls or priceless artwork. It had been discovered in the quiet courage of one compassionate woman who refused to ignore the cries of 3 frightened children. And on that beautiful evening, everyone present understood a truth that would remain long after the music faded. A family is not defined only by the people who share your name. Sometimes it is built by the people who choose to stay when walking away would have been easier. And that day, everyone remembered what dignity, compassion, and unconditional love truly looked like.